Let's talk about 21st century skills and the role of technology in education in Denmark. Today I learned that Denmark is kind of a front runner when it comes to technology in schools and like an early adopter of the 21st century skills. With me is Professor Jeppe Bundsgaard. He is a professor for education with a topic of technology. I think you were also the coordinator of the ICLS study for your country. Mm-hmm. So I think you're the perfect expert of explaining to us, why is this? How does the 21st century begin early in Denmark?
I don't know if it began early, but so Denmark is a pretty small country, and we understood that we don't have any resources, so all we have is ourselves. And so we need to educate our students to actually be able to participate in the society that we live in today. So there's been a focus on preparing students not only for their work, but also for living in a networked society. It's not that it's so much different from Germany. It's like we learned most of what we know from Germany. We talk German in many ways. It's we talk about Bildung. We call it Dannelse, but it's the same concept. But in Denmark we are aware that we need to adapt and be up to date in different ways.
So how do the 21st century skills look like in Danish schools?
Actually, from back in the 60s, we had this reform of our school system where we took a lot of lessons from the reform movement. So we had a focus on that students need to develop as active participants in society. They need to learn something that they can use in their life. And since then we have like our curriculum reforms. It's not that we haven't said 21st century or anything like that, but we have focused on that students should actually be able to use what they learn. And so in that sense, we have a focus on 21st century skills because they are old skills. It's not like they are something that was invented in an American institution a few years ago. It existed before that.
We often talk about the 21st century skills as something opposing the 20th century. It sounds to me like in Denmark it's more a continuum, is it?
Yeah, but I think it's more of a continuum everywhere. It's like so in Denmark we have been focusing on how to prepare students for their future lives, while also teaching them how our society functions and teaching them old literature and so on, important things for their being humans. But in Denmark, of course, we have and I think, as in most countries, we have a focus on preparing students for the lives they are going to live, and now we use 21st century skills as the way to talk about that, and that's because maybe in the Anglo-Saxon countries like in the US and England and so on, their focus has been not so much on development of the full person. Allgemeines Bildung, but on preparing them for their work. So for them it's new. 21st century skills is like, this is what they need to learn for their work, but it's also more than just what they need to learn there. We have had that in the German countries, Denmark, Norway, Germany.
So let's look at it somewhat more specific. Mm-hmm. I today learned that the SDGs are already part of the curriculum in Danish schools. Is it true?
The SDGs?
The Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah. It's so we have in Denmark we have subjects, and then we have a few transversal skills or subjects, so they are things that the politicians say these are important things. We need to have a focus on them in schools. And one of them is ICT, so digital competences. Another one is language, so language is an important part of all subjects. The third one is innovation and entrepreneurship. And the fourth, a new one, is the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. So I think it's a way of telling teachers this is also something that you need to focus on as part of your subjects. And in a way you could see, if you look at the curriculum, we have a lot of aspects of these things already in the curriculum, but I think it's a good idea to to have a special focus. The problem is that if it's not the responsibility of a subject teacher, then it might just disappear or vanish or be something that we talk about but not realize. So, but we see municipalities who say that, for example, in some municipalities, they say innovation and entrepreneurship, that's the core of our city. So let's have a project based on or focused on that in our schools.
So it's decided on a local level?
So it's a governmental decision, but it's the implementation is up to the municipalities.
But not to the schools, but
also to the schools. So you can, as a teacher, say, this is why I do things like this. It's because it's an important part of school, and I think it's a good argument if teachers or parents aren't completely comfortable with teaching. They can say, but look at this. This is what I am supposed to do.
So I imagine that the framework set on the governmental level is not like there's a book, but more a thin framework? Or how can you imagine it? Actually, it was actually printed a few years ago. Until then, we had a period where it was only online, but so you couldn't see how thick it was. But it's not. No, it's so we have actually a very few number of competence areas for each subject. 4 competence areas, and then under each we have a few words describing, and at a few years back it was mandatory to actually teach a special version of that, but still it was very few words. Then they made it complementary for the teachers to or free. They could decide if they wanted to teach it this way or another. So it's actually a very thin curriculum, and then there are different documents describing a way that you could do it, but not necessarily the way you should do it. We learned from the ICLS studies that Denmark is very much a front runner when it comes to digital technology in school.
Yeah.
I think I learned from your work that it started really early for German standards. Could you give us a brief overview of the history of technology in Danish schools?
Yeah, we got a Danish professor of computer science, and he coined the word datalogy, which we actually use still in Danish. Datalogy, you would say, datalogy in German, in the 1960s. And right from the beginning, he started talking about the importance of this being not just something for specialists, but for everybody. And he together with colleagues, he started describing a subject how it could be. And actually it was ready almost for implementation, and then the government shifted and something new got into. So it wasn't a subject from the beginning, but it got us an elective already from the 70s. And so computers have been a central part of what we have talked about. Schools have bought computers and taught computers, and in the 80s we started having a focus on the user competences. So what was the focus was to learn how to use text editing software and spreadsheets and so on. And then and already at around 2000, almost all schools were connected to the internet.
So 20 years ago. 20
years ago, yeah. And then since then we have had like massive investments of stationary computers, laptops, iPads, interactive whiteboards, and today it's 3D printers and drones and all kinds of stuff. In my opinion, too much focus on buying technology and too little on supporting teachers in actually changing their teaching towards a more innovative teaching practice using technology. But also because of a decision made in 2012 where the government decided we will pay half the expenses if you buy digital learning material, and then schools or municipalities should pay the other half. And that made a huge difference, because suddenly the publishing houses knew that there was a business case. They could actually, so they developed material for all. So we have different material for all subjects, for all levels.
So was it a special budget for digital material, or could you decide to buy a book or an ebook?
It was digital material, and there was a few things that they needed to live up to in order to be able to receive funding from the government.
Was it something like a whitelist for material, or could you
No,
really schools decide
you
what
couldn't
to
make a whitelist because they developed it and they sold it. So, but they set up a few things that they needed to live up to in order to be able to get funding, and they make them a little harder during the time period because some publishers thought, okay, we'll just PDF our existing material and sell it like that, and that it was not what they meant when they say digitalized material. So we have these 3 big publishers who each have a good portfolio of material, and then we have a lot of smaller publishers as well.
How can technology support progressive education?
So progressive education is education or teaching and learning where students are active and they work on different projects, and they are in different rooms or at the school or even outside of school, and so the structure of teaching is a lot more complex than what teachers are used to, and technology is really good for keeping track of where are we in our working process, who is doing what at what time, and what is our which appointments did we make, and so on. We can communicate, we can produce things with technology. So technology is, if you look at your own working life, you use technology for exactly these things, and I think it would be a good idea to use technology for those things in education as well, making it a little more easy for teachers to manage this actually very complex working practice that we are asking them to do.
Are there also like drill and instruction approaches when it comes to technology in education in Danish schools?
Yes, a lot. So of course it's a very easy way to earn a lot of money, like making very bad drilling exercises online. But actually I was surprised when we did a survey of Danish, the material used in education, in the Danish subject. I was expecting to see more of that bad material, but actually there were more progressive teaching materials that was digital than that was analog or in books.
So there's hope.
There's hope.
Thank you very much, Jeppe Bundsgaard. All the best for your work.
Thank you.